There is a particular kind of invisible that a woman can be in a small Texas town in 1879, and it has nothing to do with her size or her looks or how loud she speaks. It is the kind of invisible that comes from being exactly what people expect you to be: quiet, capable, present at the edges of things, useful in the ways that women are useful without being remarkable in any of the ways that men consider remarkable. It is the kind of invisible that gets you forgotten in conversations and overlooked in decisions, and left out of the calculations that men make when they are deciding who matters and who does not. Nora Callahan had been that kind of invisible for most of her 32 years, and she had spent the last 8 of those years making herself more invisible on purpose, which is a different thing entirely. She had come to the town of Redstone, Texas in 1871, when she was 24 years old, with $40, a horse, a saddlebag of clothes, and a mind that could hold numbers the way other people hold water, completely, without losing a drop. She had come from San Antonio, where she had spent 6 years keeping books for a merchant who paid her a third of what he would have paid a man for the same work, and who had, when she asked for more, explained to her with genuine patience that she ought to be grateful for what she had. She had thanked him for his time, and she had left. And she had ridden west, looking for a place where the arithmetic of her situation might work out differently. Redstone was not that place, not immediately. It was a town of 600 people on the flat land east of the Pecos River, built around a water source and a cattle trail, and the ordinary commerce of a frontier community that needed things and paid for them, and went about its business without much consideration for anything that was not directly in front of it. The men of Redstone ran the cattle operations and the businesses and the conversations and the decisions, the way men ran things in West Texas in 1871, and the women of Redstone kept the houses and the children and the social fabric. And nobody in Redstone in 1871 was particularly interested in the distinction between these two categories being questioned. Nora took a job keeping accounts for a man named George Alderman, who ran the largest dry goods store in Redstone, and who needed someone to manage his books because his previous bookkeeper had left for Dallas. George paid her fairly, which surprised her, and left her entirely alone to do the work, which surprised her more. She was good at the work, and she was fast at it, and she finished each month's accounts in less time than George had budgeted for them, which left her with hours in the day that she used, quietly and without drawing attention to it, to learn everything she could about Redstone. She learned about it the way she had always learned about things, through numbers. She looked at who owed whom, and how much, and for how long. She looked at which cattle operations were profitable, and which ones were surviving on credit that was getting harder to service. She looked at which pieces of land were undervalued, and why, which was usually because of something that looked like a problem and was actually an opportunity, if you understood it correctly. She looked at the water rights and the road access and the seasonal patterns of the cattle trade and the price differentials between Redstone and the markets east, and she built, over the course of 3 years, a picture of Redstone's economy that was more complete and more accurate than anything any single person in Redstone possessed, including the men who believed they understood it best. She did all of this quietly. She did not discuss her observations with anyone. She did not ask questions that would make people wonder what she was trying to understand. She simply kept George's books and kept her eyes open and kept everything she learned in the part of her mind that held numbers without losing them. And she waited. She was waiting for capital. This was the simple mechanical fact of her situation. She had the knowledge, and she did not yet have the money. And knowledge without capital is a map without a horse, useful to look at, but insufficient for the journey. She saved everything George paid her, and she spent almost nothing, and she watched the town, and she waited. And the waiting was not passive, because she was the kind of woman for whom thinking was a form of action, and she was always thinking, always refining the plan that she had not yet told anyone about, because there was no one in Redstone in 1871 or 1872 or 1873 who she believed would understand it without trying to take it from her. She bought her first piece of property in 1874. It was a small building on the east side of the main street that had been a saddle repair shop until the man who ran it died and left no heirs and no will, and which had been sitting empty for 8 months while George Alderman and 2 other men argued about who had the right to sell it and to whom. Nora had watched this argument for 8 months and had spent the 8 months determining that the argument was unresolvable on its own terms, and that the only way it would end was if someone offered to pay enough that all 3 men felt they had gotten something. She offered exactly that amount. She had calculated it to within $10, and all 3 men accepted and were satisfied, and did not think for a moment about the woman who had made the offer, because she had been careful about how she made it. She rented the building to a seamstress named Clara, who had been working out of her house and who needed a proper space. Clara paid her $12 a month, which was more than the building had earned in the previous 3 years combined. And Nora put the $12 aside and went back to keeping George's accounts and watching the town. The men of Redstone did not notice this transaction in any way that registered as significant. A woman had bought a building and was renting it to another woman. This was the kind of thing that happened at the edges of the economy, the domestic economy. The small transactions of women who managed their households. It was not the kind of thing that men who ran cattle operations and dry goods stores paid attention to, which was precisely what Nora had understood when she planned it. She bought 3 more properties over the next 2 years, each one chosen with the same precision. Undervalued for reasons that were solvable, available at a price that the sellers found acceptable, generating income that she folded back into the operation without making the operation visible enough to attract attention. She kept George's books during the day, and she built her own books at night. 2 sets of numbers that occupied the same mind with equal clarity. And the second set was growing faster than the first. In 1876, she made her first significant move, which was the one that required the most careful preparation, because it was the one that involved the most money and the most men, and the highest risk of someone understanding what she was doing before she was ready for them to understand it. The Harmon cattle operation on the south side of town had been struggling for 2 years. Thomas Harmon was not a bad rancher. He was a competent man who had been running cattle on 300 acres for 15 years, and who understood his land and his animals with the practical knowledge of long experience. What he did not understand was debt, specifically the way it compounds when you carry it too long at the wrong rate, and he had been carrying a loan from the Redstone Bank at 8% for 3 years, while the cattle market had been soft and his operating costs had been rising, and the gap between what came in and what went out had been closing in the wrong direction. Nora had been watching the Harmon operation for 2 years. She had watched the numbers, and she had watched Thomas, and she had assessed the operation with the same attention she brought to everything, and what she had concluded was that the land was excellent. Good water access, good grass, the right position relative to the cattle trail, and that the problem was entirely financial and entirely solvable if you approached it from the right direction with the right terms. She did not go to Thomas directly. This was the key decision, the one that required the most discipline, because going directly would have been the obvious thing, and the obvious thing in this case was the wrong thing. Thomas Harmon was a proud man, in the way of men who have worked their own land for 15 years, and who would find it very difficult to accept a financial proposition from a woman who kept accounts for a dry goods store, regardless of the merits of the proposition. She understood this not as a judgment of Thomas personally, but as an accurate reading of the situation, which was all it needed to be. She went to the bank instead. The bank in Redstone was run by a man named Walter Price, who had known Nora for 5 years, and who had, over those 5 years, developed a respect for her ability with numbers that he would have been surprised to discover he had anyone asked him to examine it directly. He did not think of himself as someone who respected Nora Callahan's financial judgment. He thought of himself as a practical man, who occasionally found the bookkeeper at the dry goods store useful to consult on certain numerical questions. This distinction was important, and Nora had maintained it carefully. She went to Walter and she told him she had a proposal for the Harmon loan. Not a proposal that she was making in her own name. She was not ready for that yet, and she understood clearly that she was not ready for it. She told Walter she had a client who was interested in restructuring the Harmon debt in exchange for a partial equity position, and she presented the terms in the clean numerical language that Walter understood and respected. And Walter listened and asked questions, and she answered them, and at the end of the meeting Walter said he would speak to Thomas Harmon. Her client was herself, but Walter did not know this and did not ask, because in his understanding of the world, the category of people who restructured cattle operation debt did not include women who kept books for George Alderman, and so the question did not occur to him. Thomas Harmon accepted the restructuring in October of 1876. He accepted it because the terms were genuinely good, better than anything else available to him, and because Walter Price presented it to him as an opportunity rather than a rescue. And Thomas was a man who could accept an opportunity when a man he respected told him it was one. The equity position that changed hands in that restructuring was 20% of a 300-acre cattle operation with excellent water access and good grass. And it cost Nora 4 years of savings and $12 a month from Clara the seamstress, and everything she had accumulated in the small building transactions. And it was the foundation of everything that came after. She continued to keep George's accounts. She continued to be the quiet woman at the dry goods store who was good with numbers. She continued to be exactly what Redstone expected her to be. And Redstone continued to expect nothing remarkable from her, which was exactly what she needed. By 1878, she had 20% of the Harmon operation, full ownership of 4 buildings on the main street, a small piece of land on the east side of town that she had bought for almost nothing because of a water access issue that she had known was solvable and that she had solved within 6 months of purchase, and a set of financial relationships with the Redstone Bank that Walter Price would have described, if asked, as useful but minor. She was not minor. She was the single largest private creditor in Redstone who was not running a cattle operation, and she had built this position over 7 years without anyone in Redstone understanding that she was building anything at all. The thing that changed in 1879 was not something she had planned. It was something that happened to her, and the way she responded to it was the moment when Redstone began to understand, slowly and with considerable difficulty, that it had been misreading the situation for 7 years. A man named Harlon Webb came to Redstone in the spring of 1879. He was from Austin, well-dressed and well-connected and very confident in the way of men who have money and are used to it doing the work for them. He was buying land, consolidating properties along the cattle trail with the intention of building a larger operation that he would manage from Austin, while hired men ran the day-to-day work. This was a model that was becoming more common as Eastern money came into Texas, and it was not inherently a bad model, but Harlon Webb's version of it had a particular quality that Nora identified in his first week in Redstone. He was not buying. He was acquiring. There is a difference. Buying is a transaction between 2 parties who have agreed on terms that both find acceptable. Acquiring is what happens when one party has significantly more information and leverage than the other, and uses both to get what they want at a price that benefits them considerably more than it benefits the person selling. Harlon Webb was very good at acquiring. He had been acquiring properties in 3 counties, and the people who had sold to him had in most cases not fully understood what they were selling or at what price relative to the actual value, and by the time they understood it, he was already in Austin and the papers were signed. He identified the Harmon operation as a target in his second week in Redstone. Nora knew this because Thomas Harmon told her. He came to the dry goods store on a Wednesday afternoon with the particular expression of a man who has been offered money and is not sure whether to be pleased or suspicious, and he told her about the conversation with the man from Austin and the offer he had made and the terms he was proposing. He told her because he had come to trust her numerical judgment over the 3 years since the debt restructuring, in the way that men sometimes come to trust a woman's judgment on financial matters without ever quite deciding that this is what they are doing. She looked at the terms Thomas described, and she understood immediately and precisely what they meant, which was that Harlon Webb had done his homework on the property values and had made an offer that was 17% below the operation's actual worth in a way that was carefully constructed to be difficult to see unless you knew exactly what to look for. She told Thomas to give her a week. He gave her a week because she asked him to, and because he had learned that when she asked for a week, she had a reason. What she did in that week was prepare the counteroffer, which required her to do something she had been avoiding for 7 years, which was to make herself visible. Not partially visible, not visible through intermediaries and careful positioning, fully visible, in her own name, as the person who was making the offer and who had the standing to make it. She could not counter Harlon Webb through Walter Price this time, because the counter required disclosing the equity position in the Harmon operation, and the equity position was hers, and it was time for Redstone to know it. She went to see Thomas first. She sat at his kitchen table, and she showed him her books, the real ones, the private ones, the ones that contained 7 years of careful building, and she told him what she owned and what she had been doing, and why she had been doing it quietly. Thomas sat across from her and looked at the numbers for a long time without saying anything. And when he finally spoke, he said, "You own 20% of my ranch." She said, "Yes." He said, "For 3 years." She said, "Yes." He looked at her with the expression of a man recalibrating an entire relationship, and then he said, "Did you know what you were doing when you restructured my debt?" She said, "Yes. I knew exactly what I was doing. And you got fair terms, and I got a fair position, and the operation has been running better for 3 years than it was running before," which is true. He was quiet for another moment. Then he said, "What are you proposing now?" She told him. She proposed a full partnership, not the 20% she already held, a full, equal partnership, 50-50, in an expanded operation that would incorporate the Harmon land and the east side parcel she owned and 2 adjacent properties that she had identified as available and appropriately priced. She laid out the numbers with the precision of someone who had been preparing them for years, which she had. And the numbers were good, genuinely good, better than anything Harlon Webb was offering and better than what Thomas could do alone with his current debt situation. Thomas listens to all of it. Then he asked her why she had waited 7 years to have this conversation. She said, "Because 7 years ago you would not have had it with me. You would have thanked me for my thoughts and gone to talk to a man about it." He was quiet for a long time after that. Then he said she was probably right. And then he said, "I would like to have it now." They shook hands across the kitchen table, and the handshake was the kind of handshake that both of them understood was the beginning of something serious. Not a polite gesture, but a real agreement between 2 people who respected each other and were committing to something that would require both of them to do things they had not done before. Nora went to see Harlon Webb the following morning. She went alone, which was a choice she made deliberately, because going alone was a statement about what she considered herself to be in this conversation. A principal, not a representative, not an intermediary, not a woman delivering a message on behalf of someone else. She went to the hotel where he was staying, and she asked for him at the desk, and she was shown to the parlor where he was having coffee, and she sat down across from him without being invited to sit. And she told him that the Harmon operation was not available at the price he had offered, because the price he had offered was 17% below its actual value, and she was prepared to demonstrate this with documentation if he was interested in seeing it. Harlon Webb looked at her the way men look at unexpected things, the half-second recalibration of a person who had one model of what was about to happen and is now processing evidence that the model was wrong. He was a smart man, and the recalibration was quick, and, to his credit, he did not condescend to her or dismiss what she had said. He asked her who she was representing. She said, "Myself. I am Nora Callahan. I hold a 20% equity position in the Harmon operation, and I have entered into a partnership agreement with Thomas Harmon for the expansion of that operation, and we are not selling." Harlon Webb looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "You hold 20% of the Harmon cattle operation." She said, "Yes." He said, "Since when?" She said, "Since 1876. He picked up his coffee cup and looked at it for a moment, and then he looked back at her and said, "Nobody in this town knows that." She said, "No, they don't." He looked at her for a long time. Then he said something she had not expected, which was, "I would like to understand how you built that position. Not to counter it. I have enough ranches. I am asking because what you have described is more sophisticated than most of what I encounter in towns this size, and I am genuinely curious about the person who built it." She looked at him carefully. She assessed him the way she assessed everything, methodically, honestly, looking for what was real and what was performance. And what she found was that the curiosity was genuine. He was a man who had spent years acquiring properties from people who did not understand what they had and what he was doing, and he had just met someone who had built something without anyone understanding what they had built or what she was doing, and he recognized the methodology, even though the goal was different. She told him. Not everything. She was not a woman who told everything to anyone, but enough, the outline of it. The 7 years of keeping accounts and watching numbers and building positions without becoming visible. He listened with the attention of a man who was hearing something professionally interesting, and when she finished, he said, "You had the map, but you didn't have the horse." She said, "Yes." He said, "And now you have both." She said, "Yes." They sat in the hotel parlor for another hour. At the end of it, Harlon Webb left Redstone without buying the Harmon operation, and with a business card in his pocket that had Nora Callahan's name on it, because she had printed 20 of them the previous year, in anticipation of a moment like this one, and she had given him one without making a performance of it, just slid it across the table at the end of the conversation, with the matter-of-fact ease of a woman who had been expecting to need it. Redstone found out about Nora's position in the Harmon operation gradually, the way things come out in small towns, through Thomas telling his neighbors and the neighbors telling their neighbors, and the story gaining detail and emphasis at each retelling, until it reached the version that everyone eventually settled on, which was that the bookkeeper at the dry goods store had been quietly buying up Redstone for 7 years, and nobody had noticed, and the man from Austin had come to buy a cattle operation, and left with a business card instead. The reactions varied. George Alderman, who had paid her fairly for 7 years and left her alone to do the work, felt something that he described as satisfaction, a sense that his judgment in hiring her had been vindicated in a way that was larger and more interesting than he had anticipated. Walter Price felt a complicated mixture of professional admiration and personal embarrassment that he had not understood what was happening under his nose, which was not an entirely comfortable feeling for a banker. Thomas Harmon felt, he told her later, like a man who had bought a horse thinking it was one kind of animal and discovered it was something considerably more interesting, and he meant this as a compliment, and she accepted it as one. The men who had been doing business in Redstone for years and who had looked at Nora Callahan for 7 years and seen a woman who kept accounts, felt various things that were mostly variations on surprise, because surprise was the only available response to having been wrong about something this completely for this long. A few of them were gracious about it. A few were not. Most of them eventually came around to something like respect, not because they had changed their fundamental understanding of the world, but because the numbers were undeniable, and in Redstone, numbers were the language that mattered most, and Nora spoke it better than anyone in town. She ran the expanded operation with Thomas through 1879 and into 1880, and the operation performed the way she had calculated it would perform, which was well. She bought 2 more properties that year, openly this time, in her own name, because there was no longer any strategic reason to be invisible, and being invisible had always been a means rather than an end. The business card she had given Harlon Webb produced a letter from Austin in the summer of 1880, with a proposition that she considered carefully and partially accepted, entering into a consulting arrangement that brought Austin capital into Redstone on terms that she had negotiated herself, and that were considerably better than the terms Harlon had originally offered Thomas Harmon. She hired a woman to keep the accounts for George Alderman, not because she could not still do the work, she could have done it in her sleep, but because she no longer needed to, and because there was another woman in Redstone who needed a job, and who was good with numbers, and who deserved fair pay for honest work. She paid her what she would have paid a man, which was not the rate George was offering, and George accepted this without argument, because Nora was his largest commercial landlord by that point, and they both understood what that meant. She sat in her office on the 2nd floor of the first building she had ever bought, the one that had been a saddle repair shop in 1874, and she looked out the window at Redstone's Main Street, and she thought about $40 and a horse and a mind that could hold numbers without losing them. She thought about the merchant in San Antonio who had explained to her patiently that she ought to be grateful for what she had, and she thought about the 7 years of quiet building and the week she had spent preparing to be visible, and the morning she had walked into the hotel and sat down across from a man from Austin without being invited to sit. She was not angry at the men who had underestimated her. She had considered anger and found it unproductive, and had chosen something more useful, which was strategy. And the strategy had worked better than anger would have. But she was glad. She was deeply, quietly, completely glad about how it had worked out. Not because she had beaten anyone. She had not been trying to beat anyone. She had been trying to build something. But because the building had been real, and the thing built was solid, and it was hers. And it had been hers all along, and now everyone knew it. She was 32 years old. She had $40 when she arrived, and she had considerably more than that now. And she had the ranch, and the buildings, and the partnerships, and the business card of a man in Austin who took her calls. And she had the particular satisfaction of a person who has been underestimated comprehensively, and has used the underestimation as the most efficient tool available. The window of her office looked out at the main street of Redstone, where 600 people went about their daily business, and she watched them, and she thought about what came next, because there was always something that came next, and thinking about what came next was what she did, what she had always done, from the first day she arrived in this town with $40 and a horse and a mind that nobody in Redstone had yet understood the full extent of. They were beginning to understand it now. She had waited a long time for that. She had waited 7 years, to be precise. It had been worth every single day. Nora Callahan ran the expanded cattle operation in Redstone until 1895, when she sold her majority position at full value to Thomas Harmon's son, who had grown up watching her and understood exactly what he was buying. She kept the buildings. She kept the East Side land. She kept the office on the 2nd floor of the first building she had ever bought. George Alderman's dry goods store closed in 1891. He told anyone who would listen that the best financial decision he had ever made was hiring a woman who was good with numbers and leaving her alone to do the work. He was right.